The hook. What happens when the medical system fails you so completely that you're left to die on a hospital bathroom floor, only to discover that your forgotten past holds the key to your survival? Sometimes the people who save your life are the ones you served with 20 years ago, and sometimes a single phone call can turn a death sentence into a second chance. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a man whose military service seemed like a distant memory until the day it became his lifeline. Marcus Chen had always believed that if you kept your head down and worked hard, life would treat you fairly. At 52, he had built a quiet existence in Portland, Oregon, working as a maintenance supervisor at a small manufacturing plant. His days were predictable. Wake at 5:30, coffee and toast, drive to work through the misty Oregon morning, spend 8 hours fixing broken machinery and managing a small crew, then home to his modest apartment where he would cook simple meals and watch old war movies until bedtime.
The military felt like another lifetime now. 23 years had passed since Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and those memories seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The young soldier who had jumped out of helicopters and carried wounded comrades through hostile territory had been replaced by a middle-aged man whose biggest challenge was usually a malfunctioning conveyor belt or a temperamental boiler. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. Marcus woke feeling slightly off balance, as if the world had tilted just a few degrees while he slept. He chalked it up to poor sleep and made his coffee stronger than usual. The drive to work felt different somehow. The familiar streets seemed to stretch longer, and he found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. At the plant, his crew noticed he seemed distracted. Tommy, one of his younger mechanics, asked if he was feeling all right. Marcus waved off the concern with a grunt and buried himself in paperwork, but the strange sensation persisted. By lunch, he had developed a nagging headache that seemed to pulse behind his right eye. The afternoon brought new symptoms. Marcus found himself stumbling slightly as he walked between machines, and twice he had to steady himself against a wall when sudden waves of dizziness hit. When he tried to explain a repair procedure to one of his workers, the words seemed to tangle in his mouth. The man looked confused and asked him to repeat himself, but Marcus couldn't remember what he had been trying to say. By 4 o'clock, the headache had intensified into something that felt like someone was driving a railroad spike through his skull. The pain was unlike anything he had experienced, even during his military service when he had taken shrapnel to the leg during a mission in Afghanistan. This was different. A deep, throbbing agony that made him nauseous and sensitive to every sound and light. Sarah, the plant's office manager, found him sitting in his small office, with his head in his hands. She took one look at his pale, sweaty face and declared that he was going to the hospital whether he liked it or not. Marcus wanted to protest, but another wave of pain crashed over him, leaving him unable to argue. The ride to Portland General Hospital was a blur of stop signs and traffic lights that seemed blindingly bright. Sarah drove while Marcus pressed his palms against his temples, trying to contain the pain that felt like it might split his head open. Every bump in the road sent new spikes of agony through his skull, and by the time they reached the emergency room, he was struggling to keep from vomiting. The waiting room was exactly what Marcus had expected from a big city hospital, crowded, noisy, and filled with the kind of controlled chaos that comes from too many sick people and not enough staff. Sarah helped him to a plastic chair near the registration desk, where a tired-looking woman handed him a clipboard full of forms to fill out. Marcus stared at the paperwork, but the letters seemed to swim and blur together. His hands shook as he tried to write his name, and after several attempts that produced illegible scrawls, he gave up and handed the clipboard back mostly blank. The registration clerk glanced at the incomplete forms with visible annoyance. "Sir, we need all of this information completed before you can be seen," she said in a tone that suggested she had delivered this speech hundreds of times before. "I can't see straight," Marcus managed to say, his voice coming out as a croak. "Something's wrong with my head." The woman looked at him with the kind of practiced indifference that comes from working in an emergency room for too long. "Everyone here has something wrong with them, sir. That's why it's called an emergency room. Please try to complete the forms." Sarah stepped forward and offered to help fill out the paperwork. But even with her assistance, the process took nearly an hour. By the time they finished, Marcus was leaning forward in his chair, holding his head and trying not to moan with each pulse of pain. The waiting continued. 1 hour turned into 2, then 3. Marcus watched as other patients were called back, a woman with a crying baby, an elderly man clutching his chest, a teenager with what appeared to be a broken arm. Each time a name was called that wasn't his, the disappointment felt like another weight added to the crushing pain in his head. At one point, He stumbled to the bathroom and barely made it before vomiting violently.
The fluorescent lights in the small space felt like daggers stabbing into his brain, and when he tried to stand up, the room spun so wildly that he had to grab the sink to keep from falling. He splashed cold water on his face and looked at his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him was pale and drawn, with dark circles under bloodshot eyes. When he finally made it back to the waiting room, Sarah looked alarmed at his appearance. "Marcus, you look terrible. I'm going to tell them this is an emergency." But when Sarah approached the desk, the same registration clerk barely looked up from her computer. "He's already registered. Someone will call him when it's his turn. He's been throwing up and can barely stand," Sarah insisted. "Ma'am, we triage patients based on severity of symptoms. If his condition worsens, he can be reassessed." Marcus wanted to tell Sarah not to bother, but speaking required more energy than he could spare. The pain had evolved beyond a simple headache into something that seemed to consume his entire being. His vision was becoming increasingly blurry, and strange shadows flickered at the edges of his sight. Most troubling of all, he was beginning to feel confused about where he was and why he was there. Another hour passed. Marcus found himself struggling to stay conscious, his head lolling forward as waves of exhaustion washed over him. Sarah shook his shoulder gently, trying to keep him alert, but he felt like he was sinking into a deep, dark place where the pain couldn't follow. Finally, after nearly 5 hours in the waiting room, his name was called. A young nurse with tired eyes and an efficient manner led him down a hallway lined with examination rooms. The walk felt like a marathon. Marcus had to stop twice to steady himself against the wall, and by the time he reached the assigned room, he was breathing hard and sweating despite feeling cold. The examination room was small and sterile with the familiar smell of disinfectant that all hospitals seem to share. The nurse took his vital signs with practiced efficiency, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm and sticking a thermometer in his ear. She frowned at the readings but said nothing, making notes on a chart. "The doctor will be with you shortly," she said, and then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone on the uncomfortable examination table. 15 minutes later, Dr. Williams entered the room. He was a man in his 30s with the kind of confident demeanor that suggested he had seen everything the emergency room could throw at him. He glanced at Marcus's chart briefly before looking up with a professional smile. "So, Mr. Chen, I understand you're having some head pain?" Marcus tried to explain the intensity of what he was experiencing, but Dr. Williams seemed to have already made up his mind. He performed a cursory examination, shining a small flashlight in Marcus's eyes and asking him to follow his finger as it moved back and forth. The bright light sent new spikes of pain through Marcus's skull, making him wince and close his eyes. "Looks like a tension headache, doctor," Williams announced after less than 5 minutes of examination, probably brought on by stress. "Have you been under any particular pressure lately at work or home?" Marcus tried to shake his head, but the movement sent such a wave of agony through his skull that he gasped. "This isn't a normal headache," he managed to say. "Something's really wrong." Dr. Williams glanced at his watch and made some notes on the chart. "I'm going to prescribe some stronger pain medication and muscle relaxants. This should clear up in a day or two. If it doesn't improve, you can follow up with your primary care physician." "But what if it's something serious?" Marcus asked, fear beginning to mix with the pain. "What if it's a stroke or a brain tumor or something?" The doctor's expression became slightly impatient. "Chen, I've been doing this for 8 years. Trust me, I know the difference between a headache and a medical emergency. Your vital signs are stable, and your neurological function appears normal. You're experiencing a very common condition that affects millions of people." Marcus wanted to argue, to insist that this was different from any headache he had ever experienced, but Dr. Williams was already heading for the door. A nurse appeared with a prescription and discharge instructions, speaking in a kind of rapid, rehearsed manner that suggested she gave these same instructions dozens of times every day. The ride home was a nightmare. Despite the pain medication they had given him at the hospital, Marcus felt worse than before. The car's movement made him nauseous, and every streetlight that flashed past felt like a strobe light aimed directly at his brain. Sarah drove as carefully as possible, but even the gentlest turns made Marcus groan with pain. Back at his apartment, Sarah helped him to his bedroom and made sure he had water and the new medications within reach. She offered to stay, but Marcus insisted he would be fine. He just needed to sleep, he told her. Everything would be better in the morning. But morning brought no relief. If anything, the pain had intensified overnight. Marcus woke on his bathroom floor with no memory of how he had gotten there. His shirt was soaked with sweat and vomit, and when he tried to stand, his legs wouldn't support him. The room spun violently, and strange colors flashed at the edges of his vision. He managed to crawl back to his bedroom and reach for his phone. His fingers, which had once been steady enough to defuse explosive devices and perform delicate mechanical repairs, shook so badly that he could barely dial. He called the hospital's emergency line, but when he tried to explain his symptoms, his words came out slurred and confused. The person on the other end of the line sounded skeptical. "Sir, if this is a true emergency, you should call 911. Otherwise, you can return to the emergency room for reevaluation." Marcus knew he couldn't drive, and the thought of another 5-hour wait in that crowded emergency room felt impossible. He called Sarah, but she was at work and couldn't leave immediately. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was elderly and didn't drive. He realized with growing panic that he had no one to help him. The next few hours passed in a haze of increasing confusion and pain. Marcus found himself on the bathroom floor again, this time with blood in his vomit. His vision was becoming increasingly distorted, with strange geometric patterns overlaying everything he tried to look at. Most frightening of all, he was beginning to lose track of time and place. At one point, he found himself trying to call his old army unit, convinced that he was late for a mission briefing. It was during one of these confused episodes that he remembered the card. Years ago, after his discharge from the military, he had received a business card from Colonel James Morrison, his former commanding officer who had gone on to work in military medicine. Morrison had told him to call if he ever needed anything. But that had been over 15 years ago, and Marcus had never used the contact. Somehow, through the fog of pain and confusion, Marcus remembered where he had kept that card. It was in an old shoebox in his closet, along with other military memorabilia that he rarely looked at anymore. Crawling on his hands and knees, he made his way to the closet and began searching through boxes with hands that shook uncontrollably. When he finally found the card, the phone number was barely legible after years of being shuffled around in the box. Marcus had to try 3 times to dial it correctly, and when the phone began ringing, he wasn't even sure what he was going to say. The man who answered probably wouldn't even remember him after all these years. But Colonel Morrison's voice came through the phone exactly as Marcus remembered it. Calm, authoritative, and immediately alert. "This is Morrison. Sir, this is Marcus Chen. I served under you in the 75th Rangers. I know this is crazy, but I'm in trouble and I don't know who else to call." There was a brief pause and then Morrison's voice became sharp with concern. "Marcus?"
Staff Sergeant Chen? What's wrong, son? Through slurred speech and mounting confusion, Marcus tried to explain what had happened at the hospital and how his condition had deteriorated.
Morrison asked a series of rapid-fire questions about Marcus's symptoms, his medical history, and the treatment he had received. With each answer, the colonel's voice became more urgent.
"Marcus, listen to me very carefully," Morrison said finally. "You need to get to a hospital immediately, but not the one that discharged you.
Can you get someone to drive you to the Veterans Affairs Hospital downtown?" "I don't think I can," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't see straight, and I keep passing out." "Then I'm calling an ambulance," Morrison said. "But first, I need you to do something for me. I'm going to give you the direct number for Dr. Rebecca Hayes at the VA hospital. She's the chief of neurology there, and she's a friend of mine. I want you to call her right now and tell her that Colonel Morrison sent you. Tell her about your symptoms and that you need immediate evaluation for possible intracranial pressure." "Can you remember that?" Marcus repeated the phrase back as best he could, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. Morrison gave him Dr. Kia Hayes' number and made him repeat it back twice to make sure he had it right. "I'm also calling ahead to let her know you're coming," Morrison continued. "Marcus, I want you to know that you're not crazy and you're not overreacting. From what you're describing, this could be very serious. The civilian ER made a mistake, but we're going to fix it."
After hanging up with Morrison, Marcus felt a small spark of hope for the first time in 2 days. He dialed Dr.
Hayes' number with trembling fingers, and when she answered, her voice carried the same note of professional concern that he remembered from the best military medics he had served with. Rebecca Hayes answered her phone on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the late hour. She had been reviewing patient files in her office when Colonel Morrison's call came through, and she was already pulling up Marcus's military medical records on her computer as she spoke.
"Mr. Chen, this is Dr. Hayes. Colonel Morrison just called me about your situation. I need you to describe your symptoms to me in detail, and I want you to know that I'm taking this very seriously."
Marcus felt tears of relief forming in his eyes as he struggled to explain his condition. "Williams at the civilian hospital. Dr. Hayes asks specific questions about the progression of his symptoms, the exact nature of his pain, and any neurological changes he had noticed." She listened without interruption as he described the confusion, the vision problems, and the increasing difficulty with coordination. Chen, I'm looking at your military medical history right now, Dr. Hayes said when he finished. I see that you sustained a significant head injury during your deployment in Afghanistan in 2003. You were treated for traumatic brain injury and returned to duty after 3 months of recovery. Is that correct? Marcus was surprised she could access those records so quickly. Yes, ma'am. I took shrapnel from an IED explosion, but that was over 20 years ago, and I was cleared for full duty afterward. Sometimes the effects of traumatic brain injuries can manifest years or even decades later. Dr. Hayes explained. What you're describing sounds like it could be related to that old injury, possibly involving increased intracranial pressure or the development of post-traumatic hydrocephalus. We need to get you here immediately for imaging studies. Marcus tried to explain that he couldn't drive and had no way to get to the hospital, but Dr. Hayes cut him off. Don't worry about transportation. I'm dispatching one of our medical transport units to your location right now. Colonel Morrison gave me your address and they should be there within 20 minutes. In the meantime, I want you to stay on the phone with me. The next 20 minutes felt like hours as Marcus lay on his bathroom floor talking to Dr. Hayes while waves of pain and nausea crashed over him. She kept him focused by asking about his military service, his current job, and his living situation. Her calm, professional voice served as an anchor in the storm of confusion that was overtaking his mind. Tell me about your unit in the Rangers, she said when Marcus began to sound particularly disoriented. What was your specialty? Marcus found that talking about his military days helped him focus. I was a combat engineer, he managed to say. Explosive ordnance disposal, bridge building, that kind of thing. We worked a lot with special forces units on demolition operations. That explains why Colonel Morrison remembers you so well, Dr. Hayes said. He spoke very highly of your service record when he called. He said you saved several lives during that IED incident. Marcus had never thought of it that way. In his memory, the explosion had been a failure on his part. He hadn't detected the device quickly enough to prevent the blast that wounded 3 of his teammates. But Dr. Hayes' words reminded him that he had continued working despite his own injuries, helping to evacuate the wounded and secure the area, asking for questions about race and journaling and showing your lawyers. The sound of sirens outside his apartment building brought him back to the present. The medical transport team arrived with a stretcher and professional efficiency that reminded Marcus of military medics. Unlike the staff at the civilian hospital, these paramedics treated him with respect and urgency. They carefully moved him onto the stretcher, started an IV line to keep him hydrated, and monitored his vital signs during the ride to the VA hospital. The difference between the 2 hospitals was immediately apparent. While the civilian emergency room had been crowded and chaotic, the VA hospital felt organized and purposeful. Dr. Hayes was waiting for them at the entrance, a tall woman with graying hair and the kind of authoritative presence that Marcus recognized from his best military officers. Mr. Chen, I'm Dr. Hayes, she said as the paramedics wheeled him inside. We're going to take very good care of you. First, we're going to get some imaging studies done to see what's going on inside your head. The CT scan revealed what Dr. Hayes had suspected. Marcus's old brain injury had created scar tissue that was now blocking the normal flow of cerebrospinal fluid, causing a dangerous buildup of pressure inside his skull. The condition, called post-traumatic hydrocephalus, could be fatal if left untreated. But it was also completely treatable with the right medical intervention. Good news is that we caught this in time, Dr. Hayes explained as she showed Marcus the scan results. The bad news is that you're going to need surgery to relieve the pressure. We'll need to install a shunt system to drain the excess fluid. Marcus stared at the images of his brain, seeing the areas where fluid had accumulated and created the pressure that had been causing his symptoms. How long do I have? He asked. We're going to do the surgery first thing in the morning, Hayes replied. Tonight, we'll keep you comfortable and monitor your condition closely. The procedure itself is relatively straightforward, and the recovery time is usually pretty quick. As they prepared him for admission, Marcus thought about how different his experience had been at the 2 hospitals. At the civilian ER, he had been treated as just another patient with a common complaint. Here at the VA, his military service record had opened doors and created connections that quite literally saved his life. Colonel Morrison arrived at the hospital around midnight, having driven 3 hours from his home in Seattle after learning about Marcus's condition. The colonel was older now, his hair completely gray, and his face lined with years of command responsibility. But his eyes were the same sharp, intelligent ones that Marcus remembered from their deployments together. How are you feeling, Sergeant? Morrison asked, settling into the chair beside Marcus's hospital bed. Better, sir. Scared about the surgery, but better. Marcus was amazed that his former commander had driven through the night just to check on him.
I can't believe you remembered me after all these years. Morrison smiled. Are you kidding? You think I'd forget the engineer who kept working with shrapnel in his head to get my wounded soldiers out of that kill zone? That day in Kandahar, you saved 3 lives while you were bleeding from your own head wound. Marcus had never heard the story told that way before. In his memory, the IED explosion had been a traumatic event that had nearly ended his military career. He had spent months in recovery, fighting through headaches and cognitive difficulties that the doctors had assured him would resolve with time. And they had resolved, for the most part. He had returned to duty and served for several more years before completing his service and transitioning to civilian life. Why didn't anyone tell me this could happen? Marcus asked. The doctors said my brain injury was completely healed. Medical knowledge evolves, Morrison explained. 20 years ago, we didn't fully understand the long-term effects of traumatic brain injuries. We're learning more all the time about how these injuries can affect people years or even decades later. The important thing is that we caught it now, and you're going to be fine. Dr. Hayes stopped by around 2 in the morning to check on Marcus's condition and discuss the surgery procedure. She explained that they would be installing a ventriculoperitoneal shunt, a small tube that would drain excess fluid from his brain into his abdominal cavity where it could be safely absorbed by his body. The surgery takes about an hour, she explained. Recovery is usually pretty straightforward. Most patients notice an improvement in their symptoms within a few days, and you should be able to return to normal activities within a few weeks. What about work? Marcus asked. I have responsibilities at the plant. Let's focus on getting you healthy first, Hayes said gently. But there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to return to your regular job once you've recovered. Despite the pain medication, Marcus found it difficult to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself reliving that day in Afghanistan when the IED had exploded, mixing those memories with his recent experience at the civilian hospital. He thought about how close he had come to dying on his bathroom floor, alone and dismissed by medical professionals who should have known better. Colonel Morrison stayed through the night, dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair and waking up whenever Marcus stirred. Having his old commanding officer there provided a comfort that Marcus hadn't expected. It reminded him that he wasn't alone in the world, that the connections he had made during his military service still mattered. Around dawn, Sarah arrived at the hospital. She had been frantic with worry when she couldn't reach Marcus the previous evening, and had spent most of the night calling hospitals trying to find him. When she learned about his condition and the upcoming surgery, she immediately asked for time off work to stay with him. I'm so sorry I couldn't help you yesterday, she said, tears in her eyes. If I had known how serious it was, I would have insisted they do more tests at the other hospital. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. It's not your fault. You did everything you could. If you hadn't been there to drive me to the hospital in the first place, things might have been even worse. Dr. Hayes arrived at 7 to begin pre-operative preparations. She reviewed the surgical procedure one more time and answered Marcus's remaining questions about risks and recovery time. The surgery itself carried minimal risk, she explained, but like any operation involving the brain, there were certain precautions they needed to take. As they prepared to wheel him into the operating room, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. After 2 days of escalating pain and confusion, he was finally going to get the help he needed. More importantly, he had been reminded that his military service had created lasting bonds with people who would go to extraordinary lengths to help him. See you on the other side, Sergeant, Colonel Morrison said, as the orderlies prepared to move the gurney. Thank you for everything, sir, Marcus replied. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Morrison smiled. Just get better and get back to your life. That's all the repayment I need. The surgery went exactly as Dr. Hayes had predicted. Marcus woke up in the recovery room with a small bandage on his head and, for the first time in days, no pain. The crushing pressure that had been building in his skull was gone, replaced by a feeling of lightness that made him almost dizzy with relief. Over the next few days, as Marcus recovered in the hospital, he received visits from several other veterans who had heard about his case through the informal network that connected former service members. Some were dealing with their own delayed effects from military injuries, while others simply wanted to show support for a fellow veteran who had nearly fallen through the cracks of the medical system. One visitor was particularly unexpected. Tommy Rodriguez had been one of the soldiers wounded in the same IED explosion that had injured Marcus in Afghanistan. Rodriguez had spent months in recovery and had eventually been medically retired from the military. Now he worked as a counselor at a veteran service organization, helping other former service members navigate the complex world of VA benefits and medical care. I heard through the grapevine that you were here,
Rodriguez said when he arrived at Marcus's room. Figured I'd stop by and see how you were doing. Marcus was amazed to see his old teammate. They had lost touch after Rodriguez's medical retirement. Learning that Rodriguez was now helping other veterans felt like a perfect circle closing. You saved my life that day in Kandahar, Rodriguez said as they caught up. When that IED went off, I was unconscious and bleeding out. You dragged me to cover and kept pressure on my wounds until the medics arrived. I never got to properly thank you for that. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise. I was just doing my job. Any of us would have done the same thing. Maybe, Rodriguez said. But you're the one who actually did it. And now look, 20 years later, the military brotherhood is returning the favor. Colonel Morrison, Dr. Hayes, all of us showing up here. That's what happens when you take care of your people. As Marcus reflected on Rodriguez's words, he began to understand something important about his experience. The civilian hospital had seen him as just another patient, a middle-aged man with a headache who was probably seeking drugs or attention. But at the VA hospital, his military service had provided context that helped medical professionals understand both his medical history and his character. More than that, his military connections had literally saved his life. Without Colonel Morrison's intervention and Dr. Hayes' expertise, Marcus might have died alone in his apartment, dismissed by a medical system that didn't recognize the severity of his condition. The irony wasn't lost on him, that the brain injury that had nearly killed him was the same injury that had ultimately saved him. Because the injury was service-connected, it had created a paper trail that led Dr. Hayes to the correct diagnosis. His military medical records had provided the crucial context that the civilian doctors had never bothered to investigate. On his final day in the hospital, Dr. Hayes stopped by to discuss his long-term prognosis and follow-up care. The shunt was functioning perfectly, and his symptoms had completely resolved. She expected him to make a full recovery and return to normal activities within a few weeks. I want you to understand something important, she said as she reviewed his discharge instructions. This condition could have been fatal if we hadn't caught it when we did. The fact that you're sitting here talking to me is thanks to your quick thinking and calling Colonel Morrison and his quick action in getting you proper care. Subdaxest. Marcus nodded, still processing everything that had happened. What should I do if something like this happens again? If you ever have serious medical concerns, don't hesitate to contact our emergency services immediately, Dr. Hayes replied. As a veteran, you have access to medical care through the VA system, and we're often better equipped to handle conditions related to military service than civilian hospitals. She also gave him contact information for veteran service organizations and support groups for people dealing with traumatic brain injuries. Recovery from TBI can be an ongoing process, she explained. Even though your immediate crisis has been resolved, you may benefit from connecting with other veterans who have dealt with similar issues. As Marcus prepared to leave the hospital, he felt like a different person than the one who had been wheeled in 3 days earlier. Physically, he was obviously much better. The crushing headaches were gone, his vision was clear, and he felt mentally sharp for the first time in weeks. But the experience had also changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. For the first time in years, he felt connected to his military past in a positive way. Instead of thinking of his service as something that was behind him, he now understood that it was part of an ongoing relationship with a community of people who had shared similar experiences and would support each other through difficult times. Colonel Morrison drove him home from the hospital, and during the ride they talked about staying in touch and possibly attending some veteran reunions in the future. Morrison also mentioned that several members of their old unit had been dealing with various delayed effects from their military service, and that there were informal support networks that helped veterans navigate these challenges. The thing about military service, Morrison said as they pulled up to Marcus's apartment building, is that it creates bonds that last a lifetime. We look out for each other, even decades later. That's what happened here. The system worked the way it was supposed to work. As Marcus climbed the stairs to his apartment for the first time in almost a week, he felt grateful not just for his recovery, but for the reminder that he was part of something larger than himself. His military service had ended years ago, but the relationships and obligations that came with it would last for the rest of his life. Returning to his apartment felt surreal. Marcus stood in his doorway, looking at the space where he had nearly died just days earlier. The bathroom floor where he had collapsed was clean now. Sarah had come by while he was in the hospital to tidy up, but he could still remember the terror and confusion of those desperate hours when he thought he was going insane. The first few days of recovery were challenging in unexpected ways. While his physical symptoms had resolved, Marcus found himself dealing with a complex mix of emotions about what had happened. Relief at being alive mixed with anger at the civilian hospital's dismissive treatment, and gratitude for his military connections battled with embarrassment that he had needed to call in favors just to receive basic medical care. Sarah stopped by every evening after work to check on him and bring groceries. On the third day home, she brought dinner and stayed to eat with him. As they shared a simple meal of soup and sandwiches, she brought up something that had been bothering her since the whole ordeal began. "I keep thinking about that doctor at the first hospital," she said, stirring her soup thoughtfully. "How could someone miss something so serious?" "You were obviously in real distress and he just sent you home with pain pills." Marcus had been wrestling with the same question. "I think he saw what he expected to see," he said finally. "A middle-aged guy with a headache. Probably happens 50 times a day in that emergency room." He didn't bother to dig deeper. "But that's his job, isn't it?"
To dig deeper when something doesn't seem right.
You'd think so, Marcus replied. But I guess when you're overworked and understaffed, it's easier to go with the obvious diagnosis than to consider more complex possibilities.
The conversation highlighted something that had been nagging at Marcus since his recovery. His experience had revealed a troubling gap in the medical system, a place where patients could fall through the cracks when their symptoms didn't fit neat categories or when their medical history wasn't immediately apparent. A week after his discharge, Marcus received a call from Dr. Hayes asking him to come in for a follow-up appointment. The shunt was functioning perfectly, and his cognitive test showed that he had returned to normal baseline function. "But Dr. Hayes had something else you wanted to discuss. I've been thinking about your case," she said as they sat in her office. "The misdiagnosis you received at the civilian hospital is unfortunately not uncommon. Many veterans with service-connected conditions end up being inadequately treated because civilian medical providers don't have access to military medical records or understanding of service-related injuries." She went on to explain that she was working with a research team that was studying delayed effects of traumatic brain injuries in veterans. "Would you be interested in participating in a study that might help us better understand these conditions and improve treatment for other veterans?"
Marcus agreed immediately.
If his experience could help prevent other veterans from going through what he had endured, he wanted to be part of the solution. The research study involved regular cognitive testing, brain imaging, and interviews about his symptoms and recovery. But it also connected him with a community of veterans dealing with similar delayed effects from their military service. Through the study, he met John Patterson, a former Marine who had developed seizures 15 years after a head injury in Iraq, and Lisa Chen, a Navy veteran whose vertigo and balance problems had been misdiagnosed as anxiety for months before doctors connected them to a concussion she had sustained during her deployment. These connections led to Marcus becoming involved with a local veteran support group that met monthly at the VA hospital. The group was informal, bringing together veterans dealing with various health issues related to their military service. Some were dealing with physical injuries, others with PTSD or other mental health challenges, but all of them shared the common experience of transitioning from military to civilian life and navigating the complex world of veteran benefits and medical care. At his third meeting, Marcus found himself telling his story to the group. He described the dismissive treatment at the civilian hospital, the desperate phone call to Colonel Morrison, and the life-saving intervention that had resulted. When he finished, several other veterans shared similar stories of being misunderstood or inadequately treated by civilian medical providers who didn't understand their military backgrounds. "The thing is," said Robert Kim, a Vietnam veteran who had struggled for years to get treatment for Agent Orange exposure, "the civilian world doesn't always know how to handle us. They don't understand the culture we come from or the experiences we've had. Sometimes you need someone who gets it." After the meeting, Lisa Chen approached Marcus. "Have you thought about getting more involved in veteran advocacy?" she asked. "Your story could help educate civilian medical providers about the importance of taking military medical history seriously."
Marcus hadn't considered advocacy work, but Lisa's suggestion planted a seed. Over the following weeks, he found himself researching veteran healthcare issues and learning about the systemic problems that had nearly cost him his life.
He discovered that miscommunication between civilian and military healthcare systems was a widespread problem, and that many veterans had experienced similar dismissive treatment when seeking help for service-connected conditions. 6 months after his surgery, Marcus was invited to speak at a medical conference in Seattle about the patient experience in emergency medicine. Colonel Morrison had recommended him to the conference organizers, who were looking for patient perspectives on healthcare quality and communication. Standing at the podium before an audience of emergency room doctors and nurses, Marcus felt nervous but determined. He told his story simply and directly, emphasizing not just the medical details but the human impact of the dismissive treatment he had received.
"I'm not here to blame anyone," he said as he concluded his presentation.
"The doctors and nurses at that civilian hospital weren't bad people, and they weren't trying to hurt me. But they made assumptions about my condition based on limited information. and they didn't take the time to really listen to what I was telling them. In my case, those assumptions nearly killed me. During the question and answer session, several emergency room physicians asked about practical steps they could take to better serve veteran patients.
Marcus suggested simple things like asking about military service during intake, being aware that some conditions might be related to old injuries, and taking advantage of resources like veteran liaisons who could help facilitate communication with military medical records. One doctor asked whether Marcus thought his military service had made him a better patient or a more demanding one.
Marcus thought carefully before answering. I think my military training helped me to articulate my symptoms clearly and to follow medical instructions precisely, he said.
But it also made me reluctant to complain or to insist on additional care when the doctor told me I was fine. In the military, you learn to tough things out and not make a fuss unless it's really serious.
That probably worked against me in this situation. After the conference, Marcus continued to speak occasionally at medical conferences and veteran events.
He also became more active in his local veteran support group, helping to facilitate discussions and providing resources for other veterans navigating the healthcare system. His relationship with Colonel Morrison had evolved into a genuine friendship. They talked regularly on the phone and occasionally met for lunch when Morrison was traveling through Oregon. Through Morrison, Marcus reconnected with several other members of his old unit, including some he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. One of these reconnections led to an unexpected opportunity. David Park, who had served as a communications specialist in Marcus's unit, had transitioned to civilian life and started a nonprofit organization focused on helping veterans access healthcare and benefits. When Park learned about Marcus's experience and his advocacy work, he offered him a part-time position with the organization.
We need people who understand both the veteran experience and the healthcare system, Park explained during their phone conversation. Your story demonstrates exactly the kind of problems we're trying to solve, and your communication skills would be valuable in our outreach work. Marcus was intrigued by the opportunity but hesitant to leave his job at the manufacturing plant. He had been with the company for several years and felt loyal to his crew and supervisor.
But when he discussed the opportunity with Sarah, she encouraged him to seriously consider it. "You found something you're passionate about," she pointed out.
"And you're good at it. How many people get a chance to do work that directly helps people who've been through similar experiences?" After much consideration, Marcus decided to reduce his hours at the manufacturing plant to part-time and take on the veteran advocate role 3 days a week. The change in his routine was significant, but it energized him in ways he hadn't expected. Instead of fixing broken machinery, he was helping to fix broken systems that affected real people's lives. His work with the nonprofit involved a variety of activities. Sometimes he would accompany veterans to medical appointments to help them communicate with healthcare providers. Other times he would speak at community events to raise awareness about veteran healthcare issues. He also worked on developing educational materials for civilian medical providers about recognizing and treating service-connected conditions. One of his most meaningful cases involved helping a young Iraq War veteran named Jessica Martinez who was experiencing symptoms similar to what Marcus had faced. Martinez had been to 3 different emergency rooms with severe headaches and cognitive problems, and each time she had been told it was stress or anxiety related to civilian job pressures.
When Martinez contacted the nonprofit, Marcus immediately recognized the parallels to his own experience. He helped her gather her military medical records, connected her with Dr. Ben
Hayes at the VA hospital, and advocated for her to receive proper neurological evaluation. Like Marcus, Martinez was diagnosed with post-traumatic hydrocephalus and required surgical intervention to prevent potentially fatal complications.
"You saved my life," Martinez told him after her successful surgery. "If you hadn't helped me get the right medical attention, I might have ended up like you almost did."
Marcus felt deeply gratified by the work, but he also recognized that individual interventions, while important, weren't enough to solve the systemic problems he had identified. Through his advocacy work, he began working with state legislators to develop policies that would improve coordination between civilian and military healthcare systems. 2 years after his own medical crisis, Marcus testified before a state legislative committee considering a bill that would require emergency rooms to ask patients about military service and to have protocols for accessing military medical records when treating veterans. "Emergency rooms save lives every day," he told the committee. "But they can only save lives if they have accurate information about their patients' medical histories. For veterans, that often means understanding the connection between current symptoms and old military injuries." This bill would create simple, practical steps that could prevent other veterans from experiencing what I went through. The legislation passed with bipartisan support and became a model for similar bills in other states. Marcus found himself increasingly involved in policy work traveling occasionally to other states to share his expertise with legislators and healthcare administrators working on similar issues. His personal life had also evolved in unexpected ways. The trauma of nearly dying had clarified his priorities and helped him appreciate relationships and experiences that he had previously taken for granted. He and Sarah had grown closer through the crisis, and their friendship had developed into something deeper. 2.5 years after his surgery, they married in a small ceremony attended by family, friends from work, and several of his military brothers who had become important parts of his life again. Colonel Morrison served as best man, and during his toast at the reception, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them all together. 3 years ago, Marcus made a phone call that saved his life, Morrison said. But that phone call did more than just connect him with medical care. It reconnected him with a community of people who cared about him, and it led him to discover work that gives meaning to his experiences. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up opening doors we never knew existed. As Marcus looked around the room at the celebration, he thought about how dramatically his life had changed since that terrible day when he had collapsed in his bathroom. The medical crisis that had nearly killed him had ultimately led to a richer, more connected life than he had ever imagined possible. He still thought sometimes about Dr. Kaya Williams, the emergency room physician who had dismissed his symptoms as a simple tension headache. Marcus felt no anger toward him anymore, only a hope that the advocacy work and policy changes he had been involved with might help prevent other patients from experiencing similar dismissive treatment. In quiet moments, Marcus reflected on the broader lessons of his experience. He had learned that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness but of wisdom, that connections formed in extreme circumstances could last a lifetime, and that sometimes the most meaningful work came from transforming personal trauma into service to others. His military service had ended more than 2 decades earlier, but its impact on his life was more profound now than it had ever been. The values he had learned in the service, loyalty, integrity, service to others, had guided him through his crisis and shaped his response to it. Most importantly, he had learned that none of us is truly alone, even when we feel most isolated. The connections we make throughout our lives create invisible networks of support that can emerge when we need them most. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the people who save us are the ones we served alongside years or even decades earlier. Marcus's story became part of the larger narrative of veteran healthcare reform, cited in research papers and policy documents as an example of systemic failures and the importance of coordinated care. But for Marcus himself, it remained a deeply personal reminder of the power of human connection and the obligation to help others who might face similar challenges. As he continued his advocacy work, Marcus often thought about the other veterans who might be sitting in emergency rooms at that very moment, dismissed by medical providers who didn't understand their histories or recognize their symptoms. Each time he helped connect a veteran with appropriate care, each time he spoke to a group of medical providers about military-related health issues, each time he worked on policy that might prevent another veteran from falling through the cracks, he felt he was honoring the people who had saved his life and fulfilling the obligation that came with his survival. The phone call that had saved Marcus Chen's life had been more than just a desperate plea for help. It had been a reminder that service to others creates bonds that transcend time and distance, and that those bonds can become lifelines when we need them most. In saving his life, his military brothers had also helped him discover his purpose, turning a near-fatal medical crisis into an opportunity to serve others and make a meaningful difference in their lives.